Yeah. It's all right, boy. That's your niece. She's filming you. Say hello there. You're looking at a lot of land. You know, I mean, it ain't a lot to the people who got a lot, but compared to people who got 20 and 30 acres, 100 more, it's a lot, you know. It was all ours together. It was dad and mom, and then all the children. So we was fortunate enough to work for ourselves and earn a living, while most people had to go and work for Mr. Charlie or the white man to make a living, you know.
This wasn't as long ago as you may think. It was during the 1940s and 50s, and many of the people who lived in the community were sharecroppers. But my family was one of few and actually owned the land they worked.
Well, you know, garden was number one. You know, like white potatoes, peanut, red potato, turnip green, all kind of beans and okras and squash. Being on the farm, that was some real good eating.
Uncle Otis was born in 1954. He's the ninth of 16 children.
People used to say that my dad had a football team already.
And that's my Auntie B, number 12 of 16. She owns a restaurant just down the road in Lexington, Mississippi.
The majority of our family did leave Mississippi to make life better for them. And of course, life was better for them and other families that I know. The migration of the black family, we went through some very, very hard time, and the family, the adults, knew that in order to make it, they was going to have to, you know, do something else, especially if they wanted some changes, you know what I'm saying? Okay, sweetheart. Thank you, be careful with that.
My family's story isn't unique. For millions of black Southerners, change meant moving northward. And many of those journeys started about 50 years earlier, during the first wave of the Great Migration.
Right now we're in the gallery called From Field to Factory. And this is an exhibit photographically that speaks to the Great Migration and Mississippians, black Mississippians, who left the Deep South in search of a better life for their families, for economic parity, to get away from Jim Crow laws, etc. Everything that was stifling to them in the South, they migrated to the North to look for a better way of life, to get out of the actual field environment as a sharecropper and as a cotton picker, looking for some type of job that we say had dignity to it.
It's estimated that 6 million black people fled the South for the North during this 60 or so year time period. And although everyone's reason for leaving was personal, there's one word you hear often: opportunity.
It really begins in earnest with World War I. By the early 1900s, Jim Crow is really getting a foothold. And it's not just Jim Crow disfranchisement, it's of course segregation, the myth of separate but equal that was created by the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. There's this period of time where African Americans are going, okay, we got to do something better for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren. And World War I really provides the first impetus, the first opportunity to do that because of the economic opportunities in particular that lie outside of the Deep South.
During that time, the Chicago Defender, the black newspaper, printed a lot of news about the migration of black people from Mississippi into Chicago. And it kept them entertained as well as informed about what was going on, about the opportunities in Chicago. So that newspaper was circulating between Mississippi and Illinois back and forth with families and friends sharing the information that they saw in the newspaper.
But Chicago wasn't the only destination. Depending on where they lived, black Southerners typically migrated to a certain area. Take a look. People in Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas would move to the Midwest and Western cities like LA or St. Louis. Folks from Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee followed the train lines and moved to Detroit, Cincinnati, or Chicago. While people in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina went northeast to cities like Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. When they got there, men took jobs in factories, steel mills, slaughterhouses, and even on the railroads, while most women worked as maids or in the garment industry. And by 1940, many of those cities I named saw between a 5 and 9.9% increase in their black population. And that shift in demographics impacted the country in more ways than one.
Black Americans switched their allegiance from the Republican to the Democratic Party beginning in the 1930s because of the New Deal. This changes the landscape of American politics. It also changes the landscape of Northern cultural development. You have developments in the arts, in literature, in all aspects of American culture that are influenced by Black people that never would have happened if the population had not become more diverse.
With the North diversifying, the growth of some southern rural communities came to a halt as the workforce was being depleted. But that didn't last long. With the end of World War II came the mechanical cotton picker, which eventually pushed a lot of Black sharecroppers out of the picture, helping fuel the second wave of the migration. This time around, most northern cities' Black populations increased by an additional 10% or more. Get this, in 1940, Newark, New Jersey had a Black population of about 10.6%. By the end of the second migration, the city's Black population was about 54.2%. Now that exponential growth didn't come without some pushback.
One of the things that we know is that white people are much less racist when there aren't very many Black people around. And so you have a lot of white communities in the North who had been very sympathetic early on to abolition, very sympathetic to the plight of Black Southerners living under Jim Crow. But as their communities become more diverse, they feel threatened. They look around and see that this city is becoming different from the one they knew. So you get more conflict.
The response is often, okay, we got all these people coming. How do we resegregate them within our community and maintain as much of that white power structure as we possibly can? That is almost always the response. And you see in cities across the country, the rise of redlining, right? As a tool for how you control populations moving into your communities, how you keep Black, poor immigrant populations out of white areas, right? How you maintain white supremacy. And that's intentional and happens throughout the entire country. It is not just a Southern story.
Even though it wasn't the South, racism and prejudice all across our country was still alive and well. And by the 1960s, the packing houses and steel mills that once employed Black people were starting to close. Millions of Black people were still living in poverty. It just looked different now. And the civil rights movement was starting to make waves. And as the 70s began, there was a call to come back home, which hundreds of thousands of people answered.
When I came back, I realized that this little city was not as big as I thought it was.
Like thousands of others, Auntie B moved back to Mississippi in the 1980s. And although things had changed, it wasn't exactly what she had expected.
Coming back home and still seeing signs that said Black only and white, that was kind of devastating to me. And I'm like, what?
Now, 30 years later, many of those things have changed. And Black populations in southern cities like Houston or Charlotte are on the rise, which means the Great Migration is reversing.
I think it's for a number of reasons. And at Jackson State, we see it a lot. We have a really incredibly high population of students who come from northern cities like Chicago, who are coming because it's home. It's where their grandparents are from, or their great-grandparents, or even their parents, right?
Cheaper land, cheaper cost of living, ability to reconnect with family and friends. This is the homeland. I know the landscape, I know the environment. Opportunity is amazing. I can start a business. And there's an energy there that brings them back to Mississippi and back to Alabama that says we can make a change.
Yeah, you hanging in there? Keep on hanging.